The voice of Franklin Roosevelt on D-Day, offering the prayers. We see the beginning of this program. Basically, they're going to tell the story of World War II in Europe in about 30 minutes. Little artistic renditions. There'll be some photos. You'll hear some German music to talk about sort of the rise of Germany. You'll see images of the countries that were under German, German power at that time. France, Poland, Greece, everybody following. Hungary and all of that, and we will see different ways that they will view these images, though I have to say I've not actually seen it. I'm only reading about how these descriptions are, so we'll enjoy this potentially together. Michael Beschloss, explain how Americans were hearing about D-Day that day and hearing that prayer. We hear what FDR said, but FDR took to the nation. At what time of night was he doing that? What was going on? Was everybody gathered around the radio? Was it dinner time? Tell me about when Americans
Chuck,
were hearing
we hear about the so-called bodyguard of lies, and by that what is meant is the enormous efforts that were taken in England and America and elsewhere to make sure that when these Allied soldiers landed, it was a surprise to the Nazis when and where they were landing. And Roosevelt was a part of this because the night before he had given a radio address about the fall of Rome, in which he gave no sign that this huge invasion was massing. So when he read this prayer that we've just heard over the radio, he said, you know, last night when I was speaking to you about the fall of Rome, I couldn't tell you, but I knew that this enormous event was about to take place.
Right. We give you a little description. This is what they tell us. The people in gray, what you're seeing on screen, they are there to express the enslavement of their bodies, humiliation, submission, and oppression that is being imposed by the people in black. And you will be hearing some German songs at that time. General McCaffrey, you know, we look back and we assume that the entire country was united. You know, we were trying to make this, the president sort of was making this point today about the cynicism. Whenever we get cynical, think about that day and D-Day. But when D-Day was happening, it's not as if the country was, you know, there were petty political arguments taking place at that time as well. It's just a reminder that in history, the petty political people, they become footnotes. They're not a part of it anymore.
Well, that's true. You know, Michael Bunchoff's work and other historians talk about the lead into World War II with anything but unanimity. You know, we barely sustained the draft. We barely sustained Lend-Lease to Great Britain. By the way, a book to recommend to our viewers, Armageddon, Max Hastings, gives an incredible sort of overview of the last year of the war in Europe and the absolutely unbelievable levels of violence that engulfed the European continent. So, no, you're right. You know, we barely got our act organized in World War II to strike out against both the Japanese and the Germans.
Stephen Collinson, I asked this earlier of Michael Beschloss, but I asked this of you. It always just strikes me what goes on through the heads. What's it like to be a German citizen? Angela Merkel, she's a part of these ceremonies today. President of Italy, he's part of these ceremonies today. They were on the other side. And here they are presenting, and look, we're seeing these people in black. They are being represented as the oppressors. They're the Germans.
Right, right. And, you know, Angela Merkel also grew up in East Germany, so she has that kind of added angle on having experienced oppression.
She knows oppression firsthand.
Right, right. So in some sense, I suppose, you know, the Germans like Angela Merkel have also been victims of oppression. But, you know, you look at the TV and you see the news and you hear all this stuff about the European Union, fractures in the European Union and everything else. And now there's real debate about whether the European Union can survive. Countries like Britain talking about whether they're going to stay in it. They're going to have a referendum. The European Union was set up exactly to stop this kind of thing ever happening again.
Right.
So while, you know, we're talking about the arguments about federalism and everything else and coming closer together and the euro, the key point about the European project is that the EU was set up so that these kind of things didn't happen again. And so I think you can find that you know, history kind of went quiet for a few years in Europe, but as we've seen in Ukraine, as you saw in Bosnia in the 90s, as you're seeing with these debates about where the European Union is going now, it's not quite anymore.
No, it is not. Stephen Collinson, stay with us. We're going to sneak in a little break here. More of MSNBC special coverage of the 70th anniversary of D-Day after this quick break. Welcome back to MSNBC's special coverage of the 70th anniversary of D-Day, live from Normandy. You're seeing pictures of Sword Beach right now, where many European leaders, many world leaders, President of the United States is there, Russian President Putin is there, and they are watching an artistic rendition provided here by our host nation, the French government, of World War II. And we've been talking about the modern alliances that have been going on. And General McCaffrey, who is still with us, wanted to make a point about NATO. And of course, NATO has been, the President 3 or 4 days ago, I apologize, I say 3 or 4 days ago, because as Stephen will tell you, when you're on these presidential trips, the days start to blur together. But it was a very muscular speech in defense of NATO, more muscular than I've heard this president give in a long time, and it was something obviously that the Eastern European members of NATO, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, they wanted to hear that. And yet you're very concerned about NATO's future. Explain, General.
Well, you know, words can't paper over lack of reality. And, you know, NATO for 2 generations kept the peace, kept the Germans glued into the rest of Europe. It kept Turkey and Greece from fighting. Most importantly, it kept the Americans and the Canadians in Europe. We were there for 30 years with 400,000 troops. When Russia re-seized the Crimea, there were a couple of thousand tanks they put up on the border with the eastern Ukraine. We have not 1 tank in Europe today. We've got 2 brigades left. The Germans stopped the draft and have disarmed. So European Union's in some disarray financially, but NATO has really started to lose their power. That Eastern European additions to NATO, the Baltic republics, Poland, we never really told the American people we'll fight to keep them free.
Well, and I'll tell you, though, President Obama made it. It was a very, I mean, he said, it was name-checking the country, Stephen. Poland, you're not alone. Latvia, you're not alone. Estonia, you're not alone. And yet, unspoken, I got an email from somebody, it's a former administration official, and said, oh yeah, and what if Ukraine had been a member of NATO? Right. Would they have been alone? Right.
Well, and if you look at the, each European NATO member is supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense spending.
And they're not doing it.
There's only about 3 that are currently doing it. The Poles announced when the president was there that they're going to up their defense spending to 2% of GDP. It makes you think that was maybe one of the conditions for the president going that we haven't heard about. But, you know, Britain, France, Germany, they all have big welfare states, and it's come to a question of governments are choosing, do we need aircraft carriers or do we need health care for our people? So there's a real kind of struggle for these European nations to even pay their share, and the White House is getting increasingly concerned about that.
Right. What you're watching now, just in case you're wondering where we are in this artistic interpretation of the telling of World War II here in Europe, we are the Allies have landed in Sicily and are attempting to liberate Italy at this point in the program. Colonel Jacobs, this message of declining defense budgets in Europe, the president hit on it multiple times. Chuck Hagel, as he's been over here, has hit on it multiple times. Sounds to me, though, it's fallen on deaf ears in the Frances of the world, the Germanys of the world, and the Englands of the world.
I think that's correct. Don't forget the European Union's got terrible financial problems. Interest rates have just been placed negative in an attempt to get the economy going. They're probably going to have to do more than that. They're going to have to do probably what we did after the crash in 08, but they're not prepared to do that. They've got to. Their economic system doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You've got a unitary currency, and yet you've got multifarious countries making their own economic decisions. That can't last forever. So it's starting to feel like Europe is starting to sound like it's every man for himself. They're going to be increasingly concerned if the economy doesn't get better, and they're not particularly interested in contributing to their own defense. They do so reluctantly. Meanwhile, I think we've lost a great deal of credibility in other parts of the world. You've got Japan terribly concerned about whether or not the United States is going to come to its defense. You've got the Philippines actually asking us to come back to Subic Bay. You've got flare-ups between China and Vietnam, of all places. You know, about 30 years ago, China and Vietnam actually fought a war over the same issue that they're hassling each other about right now. And Vietnam won, as a matter of fact. But that was China 30 years ago. It's not the China of today. They're expanding their influence in the Pacific, and our statement that we're going to pivot toward the Pacific, notwithstanding our allies and friends in the Pacific don't see that happening. So what you're seeing around the world is a perception that the United States will not come to your aid, will not be the force that will make things right as it did 70 years ago. And there's a great deal of concern about that, both at home and abroad. Not enough, however, in Europe for them to pay up.
No, and I can tell you, though, Colonel, is that at home, there's plenty of sentiment that says, you know what, we've done enough around the world, and sort of politically there isn't pressure on the American leadership, whether it's Republican or Democrat, because we're seeing this divide in both parties, to get overly involved. But I want to go back to Europe here. Here we're watching an artistic rendition by the French here of the story of World War II, which of course is beating back and defeating the Germans. Of course, it's the Germans that are basically keeping the European Union afloat.
During the night of June
if they decide
900
to pull out, then it does collapse.
Right, definitely. I don't think the Germans will pull out. The question is, will the Germans allow some of the weaker states to stay in? States like Greece and other states like that. But just kind of going back to the history question, we're talking about World War II, but there's also a kind of genetic disposition in Europe against warfare. You know, this was we're not talking just about one war. We're talking from 1870 onwards, Europe was at war right through to the days of the Cold War. There's the British lost an empire because they bankrupted themselves fighting the Nazis in World War I. So you have a continent that was completely exhausted and tore itself apart for 100 years, so nearly a whole century. So it's not just that the Europeans don't want to get into engagements, they don't want to spend the money. And the Germans, you said they're the most popular, most powerful country in Europe. There's a very strong sense of pacifism in Germany because they're still dealing with the lessons of their history and warfare. You
know, Michael Beschloss, it's interesting. We're about to come to the point in this, and I don't know how well you're feeling like you can follow this play, and it's difficult. We're in multiple languages here, but we're about to see the 1943 November meeting. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin in Tehran. I always love this part of it, right? They met in Iran, Persia, of course, at the time, where they made the decision to open up the second front in Occidental Europe, Operation Overlord. It's when General Eisenhower was also named the Supreme Allied Commander there. Talk about that. I know you wanted to make another point, but talk about that moment and the pivot point that was, those three leaders getting together and sort of showing that united front.
Well, that's exactly right. Roosevelt and Churchill knew that there was one way that they could convince Stalin that this was a real alliance, not a fake alliance that was really between the Anglo-Americans and on one side and the Soviets on the other, and that was to open up this other front. So by saying, yes, we Americans and British and Canadians are going to commit this invasion, you know, presumably in 1944, that was a relief to Stalin that, you know, the pressure would be taken off him and that this was actually a real alliance. And, you know, Chuck, the other thing that was discussed at that conference was the other big question, because this was not just D-Day about, you know, starting the drive toward Berlin and toppling Hitler. The other question was, you know, would Germany be allowed to, you know, commit a world war once again? You know, since 1870, Germany had brought the World War, this trauma 3 times. And so, you know, I think as we're celebrating today, let's also remember, despite all the shortcomings of NATO, we now have a democratic, united Germany in the center of Europe, in the center of NATO. Many people would not have predicted that.
No, that's for sure. Anyway, General Barry McCaffrey, Colonel Jack Jacobs, Michael Beschloss, Stephen Collinson, everybody that has been on this program. I really, Wes Moore, and of course my D-Day veterans, Private Ray and Colonel and Corporal Jack Schlegel. I appreciate everybody that has helped us try to do what I think the president gave gave an important point there, which is it is our charge to continue to teach the lessons and the importance of D-Day. You guys have helped quite a bit. I want to sneak in one more break. I appreciate everything you guys have done. We'll be back here in 180 seconds.